always means it's time for Talk of the Bay, KSQD's local talk show covering local issues of interest and global issues from a local lens. And Mr. President, if you're still listening, welcome to Santa Cruz County. If you're stuck in traffic, we're sorry. It's part of life here. It's probably part of life where you live as well. Hope you got a good welcome and got a good look at all the flooding damage. And thank you for making an emergency declaration so folks that are looking at trees through their houses and broken car windows can get some help. So I'm glad we're getting some attention on the worldwide news stage here in Santa Cruz County. Well, I'm very, very happy to welcome to the microphone tonight for a conversation about a topic that really never should be forgotten, Rabbi Paula Marcus. She is head of Temple Bethel in Aptos, and many of you are familiar with her work and the work of Temple Bethel, but she's been there how long?
I moved to Santa Cruz in 1980 and started teaching preschool, so it's been a while.
That has been just a bit of time. You came exactly the same year I did, so we have that long history of being here in common. And this topic that we're going to be talking about, Holocaust Remembrance Day, which in the United States and around the world is celebrated in January 27th, I believe.
Yeah, the observance of International Holocaust Remembrance Day is January 27th. And what is a little bit confusing for people sometimes is that in the Jewish calendar, we also have what's called Yom HaShoah, which falls in the springtime. And that means the day of the Shoah, which is the Hebrew word for Holocaust. So there's two opportunities to remember what happened during the Holocaust. And one is more kind of out front, I would say, and the other is a bit of a more internal kind of Jewish communal observance.
There's something about this topic that causes people to look away. And this practice of remembering is asking people to look again. We're going to talk in a moment about the Ken Burns series, but I wanted to talk in general about where this remembering has evolved over the years since the Holocaust happened.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, is that when atrocities happen, whether we want to really recognize them, it's more convenient, so to speak, to not have to remember them because it's so painful. The level of death and destruction is so great that our minds just can't even comprehend sometimes the expansiveness of this plotting and planning to destroy lives. And I think it is really important to remember. I mean, it took me a long time before I went on a trip to Berlin and to Poland. But at a certain point, I felt like I needed to go. I went with a bunch of rabbis a number of years ago, Bay Area rabbis, and I had to go look at these places. And I didn't want to look. I mean, my grandmother, may she rest in peace, always said, I don't want to go back there. She's from Hungary. I don't want to ever go back there. Why would anybody go back there? She wouldn't even go to Europe at all. So I kind of carried some of that hesitancy and wanting to avert my eyes, I would say, for some time, but it got to a point where I felt like I really needed to see it up close and in person.
How did the stories you grew up with meld with your understanding as an adult? I'm sure you heard relatives talk about it in some way of people they lost. I don't know what year your relatives came here, but how it has percolated for you personally.
Yeah, I would say that there wasn't a lot of conversation on a personal level. I mean, my grandfather's family came from Vilna, and my grandmother, as I said, was from Hungary, and they came, around the time when pogroms had already been happening. The mass destruction of cities and villages, Jewish villages, a la Fiddler on the Roof, right? That's the portrayal of that kind of phenomenon that we can see. And my grandmother, they really didn't talk much about it. What she did say at one point to me when we were, I think it must have been when I was already an adult, actually, we went to Ellis Island. We brought our son, and he was probably about 8 or 9. He's going to turn 34 soon, so it was a while ago, right? And we were sitting on a bench, and I knew the story already that my grandmother's father had come first with one of the kids in their large family, and they came later. And we're sitting on this bench, and she's telling me what it was like when she saw her father for the first time. And then that story melded into another story about saying goodbye going with her mother to say goodbye to her grandparents before they left Hungary. And she was young and did not understand why her mother was crying when she was saying goodbye to her own parents, the mom's parents. And later, much later, she realized that her mother figured out it was the last time she was ever going to see her own parents. And so here she was taking her child out of Hungary, and it was the first time she was realized, it was the last time for her. And I will say what happened for me many years later when I went to Auschwitz and Birkenau, and we walked from the labor camp to the death camp, and the person who was leading us, who was not Jewish, who was Polish, and who was an incredibly sensitive and wonderful guide, he said, this is where the last trains from Hungary left the Hungarians, and they went right into the extermination area. And I just lost it. Like, I didn't see any evidence of whatever happened to her parents, my grandmother's grandparents, but I had this just instinctual understanding of they could have been on those trains and they could have died right there where I'm standing. So, the stories weren't when I was very young, but as a young adult, they certainly hit me and came back to me when I was there. So, and I couldn't look away, right? That, I was just right there, and there was this place, and I imagined them being on a train, not knowing what they even looked like, just knowing what my grandmother looked like.
What you're describing sounds really painful, and maybe goes back to that idea that we have a hard time looking at this story, and especially those of us who have family ties to this story, feels very personal. And the Ken Burns series that is being played right now on PBS and is also available online at pbs.org, I think, is bringing up a lot for people right now. And I know that there's a series of conversations around this. Maybe you want to mention that, and we'll talk a little bit about how this series is framed, the Ken Burns series.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest and say that we couldn't watch more than an hour or so each time when we sat down to watch, and we watched once in the evening, and then we're not doing that again because we couldn't sleep that night, right? So we watched, earlier in the day, and there have been a lot of conversations around that and how, what could have been done, what should have been done, how this might have been different, if there had been more intervention early on. And, they touch on that very clearly in the series. And I think that, we're in this community, when we're going to gather for the event that we're planning at the Capitola Library on the 26th, we want to talk about how do we prevent this, right? And there are real life things going on that we need to prevent. And I got to say that watching the series, the Ken Burns series, and then seeing again on the news some of the clips from January 6th with the flags and swastikas and Confederacy flags and all of that, that's re-traumatizing also, right? It's not like it's something that just we see as a historical event, whether it was the massacre at Squirrel Hill or all the different incidents that have happened, but to see it so blatantly in the January 6th, it just was right there. All those symbols were right there. The numbers, the swastikas, the Auschwitz being on a T-shirt. I mean, it's not like it's something that we're finished with. And I think some of what your question to me in terms of growing up, I think it's very, very clear to us now that there is intergenerational trauma that gets transferred from one generation to another, whether that's, in the womb, epigenetics, right? We're learning more about how that gets transferred even in the womb. But, there's just so much that gets evoked every time there's something that comes up like this that has been passed down through the generations. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's so much there. There's so many parallels as you're watching it. This is a 3-part series. Each one's about 2 hours long. And I just so far have only watched the first one. And like you said, I should probably not have watched it in the evening because I couldn't sleep. There were so many aha and kind of, I did not know that, or I had never thought that parts of this story and so many echoes back to the present from that time. So let's take apart just some of those. I wanted to start out by the one that they talked about pretty early on, which is that Hitler, when he was studying and getting worked up about and writing about eliminating the Jews, looked to the United States and how we dealt with the Native Americans and putting them in reservations and genocide, essentially, and said, that's my model. And that's, pretty horrifying to think about that was the model.
Absolutely. We're coming to a place of starting to reckon with that, I would say. And the other part of that I think is really important for people to think about is the book Caste, and by Isabel Wilkerson. And what she starts off by saying is that the Nazis took a look at eugenics and what we were doing with black slaves. And that when they started examining that at the beginning, they felt that they were not willing to go as far as we were going in this country, which is, when you think about it, I mean, I can't recommend Caste more strongly. It's a really important book because she makes the parallel there between treatment of Native Americans, black people, India caste system, and Nazi Germany. And when you start to unpack all of that, you start to realize, we were in the forefront of this, like you say. They definitely took a page from our book.
There's somebody pretty early on too, and I'm sorry I'm not remembering all the names of all the historians in the series, of the Ken Burns series, but he says, the purpose of this story is not to shake a finger at the past because there's nothing we can do to undo that or to feel guilty for things we had no shape in forming. But he says maybe we can learn from them and not do them again. And I thought that was, even though he says that, watching this series, you can't help but wish we had taken different turns and recognized some of the same rhetoric that was being promulgated then during the Great Depression, for example, the fear of immigrants. It's as much about refugees and immigrants, this series, at least number one, that I watched, as it is about the Holocaust. It's about our fear of the other.
I would totally agree with that. And what's so ironic about it is that, in the Bible, which we share across, Jewish Christian lines, the phrase that gets repeated over and over again is to welcome the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. So this idea of understanding what it's like to be oppressed means that your responsibility is actually to take a different path, like you're saying. And I think that's really important to remember as well. And if you're going to say that you believe in God or trust the Bible, you don't get to pick and choose which parts of it. And that in some ways is, just so contrary to what we've done and what the Germans did. And I also want to point out something else, which I think is important to think about. It's not in the film, in the series, but there's a book that a female academic wrote. I can't remember her name. I'll have to think about it. But What We Can Learn from the Germans. And there's a newer book that just came out also about the difference between what we have here in our country with statues to Confederate military, leaders versus, you go to Berlin and you see these memory stones all over the place. You can't turn your eye away. And actually, my understanding is that grandchildren of some of the people who were involved in the Nazi, movement, they were the ones that started to say, what are we going to do to acknowledge what we've done? So that gets into talking about reparations and how, some Jews have received reparations for what has happened to their family. And we have a local amazing woman, Karen Babbitt, who's a comedian and a theater person. And her mom was a Holocaust survivor and an artist. And they went to court to get her mom's art back from Germany.
I was just having this conversation with my husband on a walk today. What do you do now for Native Americans, for ex-slave, ancestors of slaves? And there was a recent story about a town in the Netherlands that had some potentially buried treasure that was looted from a bank during World War II by the Nazis. And they think it was mostly jewelry from Jewish people. And everyone's descending on this little town with metal detectors, trying to dig everywhere to find this. And the journalist finally asks at the end of the story, I was waiting for the moment this got asked, doesn't it belong to some families? Wasn't this ill-gotten goods? And oh, we don't know, So
Ooh,
it was kind of a moment of like, by the way, this isn't yours to have. Just if you find it, it's probably belonging to someone who was killed.
Right. Well, right. And the interesting thing I have to say that I think I learned in Poland when we were going to the death camps, work camp and death camp, there were factories nearby. And part of what the German plan was to profit off of the labor of the people who were in the work camps. Doesn't this sound like slavery? I mean, what we did to Africans we brought them over to work and make money off of their bodies, basically, which is what, part of what the Holocaust was about. It wasn't just about killing Jews. It was about working them to death, literally, right? And and that's the other thing, taking their clothing. They would sell the clothing of the Jews who they had taken, ransacked their apartments and make money off of that.
There was a law that got passed among the many laws that started, sort of seemingly moderately, but got more and more extreme as time went on under Hitler, that they had to register all their possessions, down to every last jewel that they owned. And little did they know why they were being asked to register, but Nazis were very meticulous about accounting for all of this things that would now be theirs. So that was a revelation. I didn't realize that it had been done very methodically and kind of systematically. If you're just joining us, I'm Rachel Ann Goodman on Talk of the Bay on K-Squid. I'm here with Rabbi Paula Marcus. We're talking about the Ken Burns series and Holocaust Remembrance Day that's coming on the 27th. And there's a library program in Capitola. Why don't we pause for a moment and let you give the details of what people can attend?
Yeah. So you have to get online to the Santa Cruz Public Libraries and reserve a spot. We're going to be showing a 40-minute version of the 3-part series that was produced by PBS. It's not something that we've edited ourselves. And we're going to be showing the movie, and then people are going to be sharing in small groups, answering some questions about their reactions to the movie, and kind of as a way of looking for how we move forward differently, right? How we can prevent hate crimes in our community. Because I feel that, when someone dies in Jewish tradition, we say, may their memory be for a blessing. Zichrono livracha or zichrona livracha. And what that means to me is that they didn't die in vain, right? That if we take that loss, the tragedy of the Holocaust, and we turn it into something where it can educate people to the dangers of anti-Semitism and, all other kinds of hatred. And, as we know, hate crimes are on the rise, and anti-Semitic acts have never been this high in our recent history. I mean, you can go to the Southern Poverty Law Center website and see. So this event through the public libraries, and I have to say, shout out to the Santa Cruz Public Libraries for the amazing work. Diane Cowan, who's been our, contact person there, incredible work engaging the community in this very painful, as you started the show off saying, conversation. It's not easy to talk about this. It's a little bit more comfortable to look away, but if we don't make ourselves uncomfortable. I mean, Dr. King taught us about the importance of stirring the pot, right? And really looking at what's happening. If we can't look back at the Holocaust and see the trauma that it has created in the Jewish community and individuals and use that as a way to educate ourselves and come together, right? To say, this is not the country we want to be. We don't want to follow in these footsteps. So that's our goal. And the Santa Cruz Community United in Solidarity, Santa Cruz County United in Solidarity, which was formed a couple of years ago, is all about that. It's all about how can we stand together to prevent these kinds of things from happening in our community. So I'm really looking forward to the event. I think, it's the evening before. In Jewish tradition, days start in the evening. So there you go. It's the evening before the 27th. And I think it's going to be a really important viewing and conversation. And, what I really appreciate is that PBS has put out materials for educators. So the teachers in their classrooms, and I want to also give a shout out to the County Office of Education, because there is now a diversity, equity, and inclusion website through the county office that has these materials, links to these materials on it. And I think that's really important so that teachers can even use some of these materials in classrooms.
And let's hope many of them show the films. They seem, unlike some of the footage that you see. I've only watched the first one. There's not a lot of shots of the camps. Maybe there are later. There's certainly some graphic images, as Ken Burns doesn't shy away from showing what's really happening. If you remember the Civil War series, there were plenty of graphic photos. So you have to pick age appropriateness, I'm sure. Growing up in the 60s, I went to a, kind of a free hippie school, and they showed us Night in Fog, I think in second grade. And I really don't think they should have done that. But it left a big impression on me for the rest of my life. And I remembered that since, I guess that's a decision that every teacher has to make and every school system has to make.
And parents.
And parents.
I mean, I've usually found that when kids turn to, like 5th and 6th grade, they're interested in young adult books about the Holocaust. Number of the Stars. There's so many of them now. And I'm seeing that more and more people are turning, at that grade, more like 5th and 6th graders, going to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. We took our son when he was about at that age. And I think you don't want to shield them from it. And it has to be age appropriate, like you say.
And I'm sure they have lots of questions. Some of the other moments that really stuck out to me were the conversation around what to do in response to what you're hearing about, over in Germany. And there's a long section of this debate in the Jewish community itself at the time, and this is before the war started, but that there was lots of news. It wasn't like it was a secret in the United States what was happening. And the Jewish community was told two different things, be quiet and don't protest, because it'll just make it harder on your relatives or other Jews in Germany, or you've got to stand up and say this is wrong and immoral and take a stand. And there was this big protest that happened. I think there were 35,000 people in Madison Square Garden, and another 70,000 who couldn't get in. So there was a big show of, outrage and concern, but it didn't move the State Department in the government. It didn't move them. And there was this one person, I think his name was Grant. He just refused. He was an anti-Semite, for one, and for two, he made it impossible to immigrate into this country. And then he said, there's no applicants. Well, he made it, you would have had to get a character reference letter from Hitler to get out of Germany at the time. So on one hand, they wanted the Jews to leave, but they made it impossible.
And there was, I think in the first series, there was a Jewish lawyer that moved to Germany to try and help people get out undercover, which was really, really risky. I mean, he put his life on the line, obviously, to try and help people leave. And, we do hear those stories. But, there were a number of people in the State Department, actually, that were outright anti-Semites who did not want to welcome Jews. And, there's a whole nother layer to all of this, which has to do with people who immigrated here, many of them German, who came first in the first wave of Jewish immigration. And then when the Eastern Europeans came, there was this kind of idea of, how do we want to identify? Like, Jews are always trying to figure that out anyway. Who are we? Jews? Are we white? What's our, how do we define ourselves? And I think that was also a piece of the picture underneath all of this. And different rabbis took different positions, for sure. And it looking back on it now, it is very painful to see what else could we have done if we had acted in a particular way or not. And it's still a question I think that we ask ourselves now, frankly, when we look at people who are refugees. And the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society every year does a refugee Shabbat, where it's coming up. We're going to be doing it on February 3rd. And we have some local refugees who are going to be speaking. And in the beginning, Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society was started to help other Jews come here. My grandfather immigrated through the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, his family. I didn't even know what it was until his last few days, he started talking highest. I'm like, what is that? And now we are helping other people come here too. So,
and there was a statement made in the Ken Burns series that a piece of paper shouldn't mean the difference between life and death. But for some people fleeing violence in Venezuela, violence in other countries right now, it is still. It's the same story. If you are being targeted by a drug gang and you have to leave that night, you're not going to have all those papers. You're not going to probably have a gazillion things to vouch for you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, we have a Ukrainian family that we've been in contact with, and, they had like 2 hours to get out. I mean, how do you just go by buses and walk and, okay, we're leaving right now. And it's like children, whoever we're talking about, how do you get yourself out of a place now to a place of safety? And it is not easy. You know that.
And that the narrative that they're taking our jobs is still, we hear that still, and yet there are, for every 100 jobs, only 67 workers in this country, job openings, right? So we have a deficit of workers, and we need those folks to come and have a job here.
A number of years ago, a network that we're involved in, COPA, Communities Organized for Relational Power and Action, we did a kind of an afternoon seminar and gathering around immigration. And I'll never forget this. We had people from the hospitality sector. We had people from education. And we had someone who owned a roofing company. And he talked about how it's so much better for him to hire people who are immigrants who pass the drug tests much easier than some of the white people that he was trying to hire. And when you're a roofer, that's important. So, this person may not have been a very, quote unquote, progressive individual. And he saw the practical implications. There was a sociologist from UCLA who wrote a book, Immigrants and Boomers. Who's going to take care of us when we retire, the boomers? Like, what are you thinking? So I think that it's easy for us to other people. And that's the part that I think, if we share these stories and we talk about what was it like, how do you live right now as an immigrant, what's your life like, we start to open up some of those doors to understanding. And it just seems to me that people who either are survivors or children of survivors have to also share those stories. And I've seen some of that happening. When we did the event with the library for the Not in Our Town the year before last, we had a video. Karen Babbitt talked about what it was like to grow up with her mother, and she carries her mother's yellow star around with her in her wallet.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's there, and she's reminded of it every day.
The Jewish population in Santa Cruz is not huge, is it? It's pretty small.
I'm not good with numbers.
I think it's about 2%, maybe 1%.
That makes sense.
Of the whole population. So we're not a very large population, but we can have a big voice. And the fact that you are involved with all these interfaith organizations and you speak publicly and very clearly about that is testimonial to Temple Bethel's stance on all of these issues. Right in front of the temple, you have reproductive rights are human rights.
Actually, reproductive rights are Jewish values.
Is
a Jewish value. Yeah. We have to do that. But I want to say one other thing. We have had, not as active lately, but the Tent of Abraham, which is a interfaith kind of dialogue group that we have had in operation over a number of years. Some really great local leaders. And when Squirrel Hill happened, it was on a Saturday morning, and I was taking a walk and Sabbath kind of rest sort of thing. The first text that came in on my phone was from a leader in the Islamic Center of Santa Cruz. Just heard what happened. I'm so sorry. Let me know if there's some way I can support you. And to me, that says a lot about our community, that we stand together. And, when Christchurch happened, into the Muslim population, we went over to the Islamic Center and people showed up, and we did an event where we talked about what happened. And I think it's just really important for people to know that in Santa Cruz, we are and we have allies. And to me, that's one of the important takeaways from the Ken Burns series, that if it's too scary for someone who's Jewish to speak up against anti-Semitism, is there somebody who's close to us who feels that they have the privilege to be able to do that? If we see something happen to a black person, do we step up and, as a white woman, do I step up and do I say, this is not okay. This is, this is not an okay thing to have happening right now. And I feel like, that's a lesson that I take away from the Ken Burns series as well, is that we have to be vocal in we used to call it bystander training. Now we call it upstander training.
There were so many stories in that documentary about the slide toward absolute fear, where people were afraid and they were getting killed for standing up. And yet some of them did it anyway, like the clerks that were stamping that young boy's papers. He said, what's 50 plus 2? Okay, you're in. Clearly he didn't have to do that, but he saw he was saving a life, this young boy, and the survivors talking in the film about that moment where he was given the papers and sent off without his family, never to see them again.
He was crying as he was being interviewed, which was just, how can you not feel that sense of, I don't even know how to describe it, but just empathy for that person. And, he's an old man now, and he's remembering back to when he was a kid.
Yeah. And the other stories of how a lot of the people they found to interview are older, but they were children, but they, were maybe 9 or 10, so they have clear memories about what happened, and obviously survived, got sent to the United States or somewhere else to wait out the war. A lot of them said, that at first things they didn't understand what was happening. Their parents couldn't really explain it. But when they saw people burning books, that was it. That was the moment they realized they weren't safe anymore, or that their own friends, their own childhood playmates turned on them and beat them up.
Right.
It was the saddest thing for a kid suddenly to have your friends, fall victim to propaganda. And as a media studies teacher, there were so many lessons here about repetitious, hateful messages that eventually trickle all the way into children who shouldn't be, hating anybody.
100%. We know about the vulnerability of people in the LGBTQ plus community and how kids have gotten bullied and shamed, and, how important it is for us to also be allies, with kids who, like you say, one day you have a friend and the next day someone's turned on you because of who you are, your identity, your core of who you are. And I think that a lot of work has to continue to be done around that because it's the same dynamic. Let's put it that way.
So these are we've talked about individuals standing up, individual allyship and people acting, with bravery in the face of all kinds of fear. What we don't talk about is institutional bravery. And something that really came home in the film series is how many institutions failed us. Hollywood was continuing to show pro-Nazi propaganda films to people in between Hollywood films. It took them a long time to realize that, they were showing.
And we thought the Jews controlled Hollywood, right? That's the narrative that we hear, is that the Jews control Hollywood. Well, that wouldn't have been happening. You know what I mean? And it's just so hard to comprehend.
Yeah, so even the entertainment industry didn't get it. And then, the State Department surely didn't get it. The president himself was trying to calculate, whether he would be still in office if he took a strong pro-refugee stance. And so he was watching, with dismay as things accelerated. So you're looking at all these different institutions. Universities were teaching eugenics.
Yep.
So those institutions, almost all of them have some part in this story that I'm sure they wish, looking back, most of them wish they hadn't played, that role. But what do they do now? This is another time when you can be passive and just watch this thing happen, the voter suppression, the attacks on our democracy and our very core values, or you can stand up as an institution and do something. And, religious institutions have been very good at, most of them, not all of them, stepping forward, religious leaders, some. But again, needs to be a unified response against all of this. And when you look at the budget for domestic terrorism, investigations of hate crimes, not big enough, not nearly big enough. The understanding of the problem doesn't seem to have sunk into our governmental institutions. And some of the people who helped January 6th happen are inside the government now.
Oh yeah, we know that. We've seen it repeatedly that, and not only that, they continue to make anti-Semitic and racist statements. They continue to think that one congressperson who threatened another congressperson it was visible, threatened them with death, is now they're working together, and this person is in a position of power. Like, what's happened? How do we, I think that, in all honesty, we do have to say the red, wave, whatever we want to call it, didn't happen, right? I mean, we have to just say people organized, grassroots people got out and started knocking on doors, and whether you talk about Stacey Abrams and or Raphael Warnock or John Ossoff, a Jew and a black man working together to win their seats, and then people joking about how many times Warnock's had to run, at this point. Yeah. But he did it, and he had support from the Jewish community. And if you look at the relationship between, say, Ebenezer Baptist Church and the temple in Atlanta, it's very profound. I mean, the rabbi, the temple was firebombed because of the civil rights work that synagogue did. But I think I'm hearing what you're saying is, how do we see this on a mass scale? How do we see this as, happening in a big way in our country? And what are the ways in which we can educate people? I think this series is a really important opportunity for people who wouldn't necessarily think about the Holocaust to look at it. I think we encourage those that we know, and that's the other part, that we have some agency here to say, hey, would you consider showing this in your classroom? It's a 40-minute version. You could do that, And I do think it's really important for us to not stop, to keep going and to elevate the message of we are built for love and caring and welcoming each other. We're not, the fear-based politics, it doesn't help any of us, right? And that's what leads to things that happen like the Holocaust.
I would say this series is as much about what's happening right now as it is about the Holocaust. And I don't think it was any accident that Ken Burns came out with it in 2023 at a moment when we might have been lulled into a little bit of complacency with the election of Joe Biden. But as we just said, there's foxes in the hen house, so waiting to do bad things. So you have to stay awake and aware and be active in this time.
Well, and you bringing this to us on the radio is really an important piece of this, Rachel. I just want to give you a big shout out for lifting this up. It's so important.
Thank you for being here to lift it up. And again, would you give the details of the Capitola event so that people might want to attend, write it down?
Right. So it's Santa Cruz County United in Solidarity, Scusic, and it's on the 26th at 7 o'clock at the Capitola Library. You have to register beforehand. So if you just go online to the Santa Cruz Public Libraries, you're going to find Holocaust Remembrance event. And it's the 26th at 7 o'clock. So you do have to register first so that you're able to attend. And it'll be a really profound evening. So thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Paula Marcus. I hope you come back again soon. It's great
I would be happy to.
All right. Have a good night. This is KSQD Santa Cruz, 90.7 FM. I'm Rachel Ann Goodman. The program is Talk of the Bay. We're going to take a short break and bring on another guest. We're going to be talking about a completely different topic, and that is pesticides around schools and how the government of California can ban some of them. Will they or won't they? We'll talk to someone who has some information about that coming up next right here on Talk of the Bay. Stay with us.